For many, the 1950s to the 1970s remains the golden age of TV entertainment, a time when television seemed effortlessly to produce a stream of classic comedy, sitcom and drama that will never be repeated.
Now do you understand what discussion is?
Yeah, it's arguing.
But many of the most fondly remembered programs from this era no longer exist, either because they were wiped or they were never recorded in the first place.
I've always found it astonishing that people could have wiped these shows. Didn't they realise that this was special?
But in the last 10 years, the British Film Institute, private collectors and the BBC have joined forces to restore some of TV's greatest moments. This programme tells how these shows are no longer missing, believed, wiped.
Well, I'm here to look at some old footage of a thing called the Complete and Utter History of Britain, which we thought had been lost, but has now apparently surfaced in Australia.
In 1969, Terry Jones and Michael Palin made the Complete and Utter History of Britain. Their idea was to replay moments from history as if TV had been around at the time. They made 6 programmes, all of which were wiped straight after transmission. The tape Terry's viewing today miraculously survived, having been specially recorded for the director of the series.
I would have seen this for 35 years. Oh, Peyton's office. Oh, great. I haven't seen the sketch. I remember it.
Morning, Carnival.
Morning, sir.
Well, what have you got for me this time?
Well, sir, this is it.
I see. Well, sit down, tell me all about it.
Thanks, sir.
What does it do?
Well, sir, it helps you sit down higher up.
I think you'll find that's called standing, and it's already been patented.
Well, it was pretty exciting. Stuff I hadn't seen for 35 years. From the show I've just seen again, I think my favourite moment, is Mike Palin as St. Augustine. I think he's just spot on.
Thank you. Very kind. Now, I wonder if you've ever stopped to think who it was who made the world.
Dingo!
Oh, my husband is summoning Dingo, the god of food, that we may eat.
Oh, yes? And what does Dingo do, eh?
He is the god of food. He provides for us.
Yes. Well, you know, superstition is, I'm afraid, only the result of ignorance, and in many cases...
But the thing about the Complete and Utter History, why it was so exciting for Mike and me, was that it was our show. It was our idea, and for the first time we'd be sort of doing it ourselves. The shows themselves, I mean, we thought they were lost. But back in the 60s, it was frustrating that we were, creating these things, creating these little almost works of art, whatever, the things we were putting a lot of effort into, and it felt sad that we couldn't keep them and we didn't have copies of them, a record of them.
It seems strange to us now in our world of videos and DVDs that prior to the 70s, television was thought of as ephemeral, with no need of a history. Only a few programmes were ever kept, such as this entertainment spectacular from 1956, featuring Bob Monkhouse.
I must say, I'm a television fan, I'm really, because I think it's wonderful. They show you dancers who dance everything, and singers who sing everything, and showgirls and acrobats.
Television entertainment was still based on the theatrical tradition of live music hall and cabaret. And although there were now 2 channels, the amount you could watch was limited to lunchtimes and evenings only.
So television was a real mass thing. There wasn't much to choose from, so anything that went out, 15 million people were watching, maybe. 20 million people sometimes. A huge amount of people watching the same thing at the same time. And this was television, therefore, that was designed for that one moment of being shown to everybody. And you didn't think about showing it again very much. You certainly didn't think about saving most of television. It was a disposable thing. It had done its job on that night. Everybody watched it, chuck it away, never see it again.
Television was evolving fast. We were much more excited by what would happen next than with holding on to old-fashioned entertainment shows. Only television deemed of historical importance was ever recorded.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
This means that most comedy shows were not kept. And even when video technology came in the 60s, things didn't get any better.
Good evening. I want you, first of all, to look at this clock and to remember the time that it says just after 9:16. Now, the reason for asking you to do this right at the beginning of Panorama tonight has all to do with Vera, the vision electronic recording apparatus. The new machine, which is in program service tonight for the first time at the BBC's research department at Nightingale Square in South London. At the moment, this machine, Vera, is recording this program, Panorama, and it's putting the sound and the picture all together onto a magnetic tape.
You've got to remember, in the 60s, videotape had only really just come in. I can remember seeing Richard Dimbleby on Panorama demonstrating the first videotape and telling us about it, showing us this huge machine and then playing it back. And we were all just absolutely amazed by this.
I want you, if you will, to look again at this clock and once again to note the time that it says, which is very nearly 9:20. When this clock jumps back suddenly, you're on the tele-recording by Vera. I want you, first of all, to look at this clock and to remember the time that it says just after 9:16. Now, the reason for asking you to do this right at the beginning of Panorama tonight has all to do with Vera, the vision electronic recording apparatus. Well, there you are. That's where we came in a way. That was the beginning of Panorama tonight, just about 5 minutes after I first did it. This is now me again, really.
But because the tape was so expensive and because the machines were so expensive, a lot of that tape was reused. They actually wiped material that they'd archived. They thought, well, there's not much chance of showing that again. Right, we'll use the tape. Tape's more valuable than what's on it.
I don't think anyone in that period ever foresaw a future for this sort of archive television. They didn't know there was going to be a huge nostalgia boom. Many didn't realise that these were valuable social documents of their time. And because television was an ephemeral art and people were looking forward all the time, I think they were less interested in their own past careers. They were going on to the next show. They were less worried about the one they just worked on.
But some people were passionate about the shows they were producing. Technicians like Bob Pratt, working on music shows, risked the sack for illegally recording bands such as the Rolling Stones and the Byrds for their private collections. But if they hadn't, we wouldn't be able to enjoy these moments now.
All I really wanna do is maybe be friends with you. No, I ain't looking to fight with you, frighten you or frighten you, drag you down or bring you down, chain you down or bring you down.
Bob Pratt compiled a lot of popular material, Top of the Pops, music material, that for his own enjoyment, really. And for us, it's absolutely great to still have these because a lot of the programmes were never recorded at all or were wiped. So we now have items of pop bands from the 60s that we would never have had if he hadn't have done that.
The policy of junking light entertainment shows also included comedy. Often the only copies that survive were those made by members of the production staff.
The best example of a case where somebody involved in the production of a programme was responsible for preserving it is probably the Lost Steptoes, the 10 or so episodes of Steptoe and Son from the 1970 series, which had been wiped at the BBC, but the writers, Galton and Simpson, had made their own copies. They did a deal with a friendly BBC engineer who ran off copies from the original masters onto the first ever domestic video format, and then kept them in Ray Galton's garage for about 30 years, where they deteriorated a little, but we were still able to recover them.
These grainy black and white images have been recovered from the first colour series of Steptoe and Son.
I don't believe it!
Was for 40 years in Pinky Barley-Boo. Langstone out of an error. Hey, what's the game? Close them curtains.
I'm sorry, Dad. I forgot. I completely forgot. Went right out of my mind.
What are you talking about?
I haven't bought you a present.
Present? What for?
For your birthday, of course. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Father.
It's not me birthday.
Not your birthday? Come on, Dad. It's got to be. You're having a wash.
Very funny.
Few people realise that the same fate could have befallen arguably the most influential comedy of all time.
We got a phone call. I got a phone call from Howard Dell, who was our video editor at the BBC, and he told me that they were going to wipe the first series in a month's time. So we hastily smuggled, he helped us smuggle out the tapes from the BBC, and we recorded them onto Philips VCRs. And we recorded, I think, the first series and the second series onto Philips VCRs. And I had them down in my cellar at home, and for about a year or so we thought those were going to be the only record of the Monty Python shows.
I've always found it astonishing that people could have wiped these shows. I remember hearing years ago that Alan Bennett's series, which was set in NW1 in London, had been wiped by the BBC. I was outraged. Didn't they realise that this was special and that people would want to see it in 10, 15, 20, 30, 40 years? How could they be so stupid?
We find that 9 out of 10 British housewives can't tell the difference between Wizzo butter and a dead crab.
It's true. You're on television, aren't you?
Yes.
With those silly women, you can't tell the difference between Wizzo butter and a dead crab.
Yes. You try that around here, young man, and we'll slit your face.
The policy of targeting light entertainment to junk, I always thought was a mistaken one, because you only have to look at the past. It's the light entertainment that records the history. I mean, a concert of Beethoven made in 1960 is pretty much like a concert Beethoven made now. It's not a... Although, you know, in those days, that was a very proper thing, you know, a very important moment, and this was history. The real history is often in the comedy.
The BBC finally woke up to the value of its archive in the mid-70s, when it celebrated its 40th anniversary. The clips of old television were so popular and contained so much history that the corporation realised it needed an archiving policy to take greater care of programmes that were BBC copyright. But this new policy only served to drive amateur collectors of television and film underground.
Film collecting for the private individual and later television collecting was always pretty much a clandestine affair. It was technically illegal. People were terribly worried that some Big Brother-like organisation was going to come along and suddenly condemn them. But there was one very high-profile case with Bob Monkhouse, which must have scared a lot of collectors.
The judge's intervention to clear him of illegally trading in pirate films had been unexpected.
Certainly don't feel like a pirate anymore. It's terrible being a film pirate, I believe. You can't watch films with a patch over one eye and a parrot on your shoulder.
He'd been arrested over 2 years ago after police raided his home, where he has a collection of over 800 old films.
They had the wrong target. I think they have a difficult job to do, and there are right targets that they have to pursue. There are genuine film pirates. They must be prosecuted and will be prosecuted.
Despite the prosecution, when domestic video recorders became available and affordable, the temptation was so great that home videotaping became rife.
Practically everybody who uses one is breaking the law. Recording almost any television program without specific permission is a breach of copyright. Copyright is supposed to ensure that artists get a proper reward for their work. The program makers have been arguing that the only way to do that is to tax recorders and blank tapes and spread the proceeds amongst the copyright holders. The government doesn't agree. The evidence for a levy, it says, is not convincing.
It's often forgotten now that it was strictly illegal to record television programs off the air on domestic equipment until after the 1989 Copyright Designs and Patents Act. Of course, the machines existed to do it, and everyone did do it, but it wasn't formally legalised until the late 1980s.
So, even if collectors knew they had some footage that was missing from the broadcaster's archive, they kept quiet. Until a shocking revelation by Dudley Moore brought things out into the open.
Like we started off this interview pathetically,
very badly,
trying to talk about the dud thing. No, but I mean that's the reaction, isn't it, of people in this country too? In the main, I would think. I mean, it's
well, except there's a whole lot of people who haven't seen those programs. You know, I think this is one thing that Peter and I both feel badly about. That I think the BBC erased all of our tapes. Thank you and good night.
Have they really?
Yeah, I think they erased the whole bloody lot. I can't imagine. I mean, some idiot maybe wanted some toilet paper. I don't know, but suddenly all the tapes we'd done over 7 years went, you know. And a lot of people know us from that era, from 1965 or whatever. The younger people don't, who didn't maybe watch television then, which is a shame.
Some episodes were subsequently recovered, and now 10 of the original 23 programmes survive.
I think there was a moment when people realised what had been lost. I think when people realised that Peter Cook and Dudley Moore's not only but also had been wiped, I think people began to realise, wait a minute, this can't be right. And at that point, one began to be aware of what was going on and saying, well, you know, we mustn't wipe these things, we've got to preserve these things.
Throughout the 80s and 90s, we saw television proliferate. The arrival of multi-channel TV led to an explosion of choice.
So suddenly there was lots and lots of television about, more than any one person could watch. There was real choice and a real fragmentation of the audience at the same time. So what happens is you begin to get the need to repeat television to reach the potential audience.
A new satellite television channel has been launched tonight, devoted entirely to repeats. UK Gold is showing old programmes made by the BBC and Thames Television, which viewers might otherwise not get a chance to see again.
2, 1, go.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The new cable and satellite channels needed material to fill airtime. Old television is relatively cheap, or can be relatively cheap, and can get good audiences, can get a certain type of audience which certain channels sought after.
Now there was a market for old television, the search for missing materials stepped up. To encourage its return, the British Film Institute launched Missing Believed Wiped.
The Missing Believed Wiped initiative began 10 years ago. It began as a response to an earlier BFI initiative called Missing Believed Lost, which attempted to track down some famous missing British films. At the time, the people within the Institute that were interested in television thought that this could be easily applied to the small screen, and we knew that material once thought lost had already come back to a certain extent, so it seemed like a sensible thing to do.
Soon it became a forum for the collecting community to share the stories of their latest finds.
I discovered a Likely Lads titled Last of the Big Benders. A collector had a copy of it for many, many years that he kept dangling, wanted a lot of money for it. Eventually, after buying a lot of things from him I didn't want, I managed to build up a relationship with him, and eventually he came across with it.
The Likely Lads was one of BBC Two's earliest successes, but was lost after transmission. This episode, Last of the Big Spenders, is the earliest to be recovered by Missing Believed Wiped.
You had a double up at Redcar, and I started 4 on my own left and all.
Oh, well, I've got an extra 10 quid on me anyway.
How much?
Well, some of my holiday money. I thought you might be sure.
We're not going to need all that.
Well, no, of course we're not, but, well, in case of emergencies, in case you want a meal or something.
A meal? What do they want a meal for? I've had my meal. I always have a big tea on Saturdays.
Well, not necessarily a meal, but drinks and other things. Taxis.
What? I've got a 21B and like it.
Well, all right, but it's just as well to have a bit on you for emergencies.
Emergencies? If I spend more than 10 quid on a woman, it'd be a bloody catastrophe.
Although happy to celebrate its rediscovery by transmitting this classic, the BBC still had no direct contact with collectors.
For a while, I think the BBC ran scared of being involved in campaigns to get the material back because, perversely, they thought it might reflect badly on them for losing it in the first place. But we convinced them that Missing Believe White was a treasure hunt, not a witch hunt, and they took it to heart and in the end launched their own initiative.
Realising the potential for restoring its archive, the BBC launched Treasure Hunt in May 2001.
We'd never gone nationwide with please bring us back material missing from the archive. So it was the first time the BBC had published missing titles on a website and asked across the country for material to come back, and also saying to collectors, we won't penalise you if you bring material back, we're only too glad to get it back in the archive.
Who do you think you are kidding, Mr. Hitler, if you think we're on the run?
One of the most significant gaps in the BBC comedy archive was the second series of Dad's Army.
I think the most successful discovery for me was the 2 Dad's Army episodes that were missing from the second series, and we got a phone call one day saying that from an elderly gentleman saying that he had 2 cans of Dad's Army, one being Operation Kilt and the other being Battle of Godfrey's Cottage, and these were 2 that we knew were missing. So I got in my car, drove out to Bushy on a very hot day, got lost, and finally drove up in this little bungalow where this old gentleman was waiting for me outside the porch. And before I'd even got halfway down the drive, he was lifting up these cans of film and trying to get them in the boot of my car. And these old film cans, quite rusty, but they had the title on it, which was quite exciting. Took it home, managed to prise the lid off with a screwdriver and held it up to the light, and you could actually see the opening titles of the British Isles. Brought it in the next day, put it on a Steenbeck, and there were the 2 missing episodes of Dad's Army in pretty good condition, considering they'd been taken out of skip in 1969, I think.
Evening, sir. Early, aren't you, sir?
Yes, I just wanted to finish this new battle plan.
Oh, I see, yes.
Unfortunately, I had to rather rush my meal.
Oh, yes, what did you have tonight, sir?
Walton pie and treacle tart.
Oh, yes, really, sir. It was a real meal, wasn't it, sir? Where did you get the treacle from, sir?
Well, it wasn't real treacle, really. It's just a new recipe that my wife's trying out.
Oh, yeah.
The pastry was made from potatoes, and the treacle was made from grated carrot and saccharine.
Oh. What did it taste like?
Oh. I think the treasure hunt publicity made it clear that there was no penalty involved in getting programmes back to the archive. It's true, the BBC does own the copyright, but is willing to, quite happy to take the material, copy it, and give it back to the collector, because they often find them at car boot sales, jumbo sales, in lofts and sheds. So they're finding them all over the place, and they're going out looking for them because it's a hobby, and they enjoy looking for old television.
As the barriers came down between collectors and broadcasters, a masterpiece resurfaced. The first ever programme in the first ever series of the groundbreaking sitcom Till Death Us Do Part. Here's Alf Garnett as he was in June 1966.
Oh, for crying out loud, what's the matter with these nails then?
I don't know why you bother. Look at the mess.
Ain't no mess, I've got a paper down, ain't I?
Why can't you take them down the cobbler like everybody else?
What, that bodger? Listen, you want a job done proper, you've got to do it yourself, ain't you?
I was probably the first to see it since it went out in '66. On the Steenbeck, just sitting watching it here.
Shut up! Shut up, will you? Shut up!
In a few moments, the Greenwich time signal, followed by the news and radio newsreel.
Right.
Well, how are the pips tonight, then? Are they all right? Just about. Ah, well, there you are, you see. There you are. You see, even Greenwich Mean Time's right now that Labour's back with a big majority.
Labour? Bloody Labour, they couldn't put nothing right, they couldn't. What? Look at that. Look at that. Couldn't even pick a decent team for us to win the World Cup.
What are you talking about? It's not the government's job picking a World Cup team.
It's really exciting to sit and watch something that was made nearly 40 years ago and no one's seen it since, and you just hope that it will be used in the future.
Yes, and you can't blame the World Cup team on Labour, mate.
You blamed everything on Labour. You blamed the weather on him if it could.
Look, no one's talking about the weather, Miss Clever Dick.
No, but we haven't had no decent weather, not since they've been in, I noticed that.
To get any episode back from the 60s is exciting. To get the very first one is particularly exciting. This is the blueprint for all that followed, and it's wonderful to see it again.
Old situation comedies are not just a chance to reminisce. They're also one of the best records of our social history.
Listen, on a ministerial level, there's not...
No, in April.
Why don't you shut up, you silly mare?
Till Death Us Do Part was a real break point in television sitcom. It was a moment when sitcom grew up, in the sense that it was actually confronting the audience with things that they might not like. It was a very edgy thing. And it was dealing with ideas, it was dealing with conceptions about other people in society that people were kind of dealing with out there. And suddenly there it was on television, there was this guy who was saying the most awful things and getting away with it. And he was a buffoon, but also he wasn't a buffoon. You know, there was a real double-edgedness about Alf Garnett that people found very difficult to deal with.
Look, in a discussion, see, when you have discussions, right, you put your salient points of view to each other, right? Yeah. See, look, you put your pros, don't you, right? Cool. Yeah. Then you put your cons, don't you? Then you like debate with any points of contention arising out of your polemics. See? Now do you understand what discussion is?
Yeah. It's arguing.
Bloody arguing, you silly moo!
I believe it was the first time that television comedy was really dealing with social attitudes. The problem is, of course, I can't prove that because I can't really get to see much from earlier.
For some people, their obsession with viewing old television leads them to collecting. Tim Disney recently stumbled upon his greatest find to date.
Really was my favourite find. It was quite surprising the way I found the Morecambe and Wise show. Really, for somebody who's actually interested in missing television, it was one that sort of crept up on me. I bought the film print from a collective via eBay. And I was thinking this would be one of the ATV shows. Morecambe and Wise did quite a few years run for Lou Grade and ATV. And I thought it would be nice to have this in the collection, just as another additional piece of bread and butter film collecting. Received the print from the collector, went to thread the film up for viewing, and realised that the leader on the beginning of the film said a BBC television film. And the list of guests that appeared on the show confirmed that this was indeed a missing episode. That for me, I would say today has probably been the most exciting find, purely because of the content. Morecambe and Wise is so loved, and just to get this film print back again was superb. It smells lovely as well.
Although collectors like Tim are happy to share their finds with the nation, others remain sceptical of the BBC profiting from their labours.
Sometimes I put myself in the minds of the most belligerent collectors and try to think the way they think. I think they think like this. I think they think that the BBC junked material in the first place, that they weren't interested in it, that they had no regard for their past, that the collectors somehow recovered it, they've looked after it, they've kept it well, and now all these years later the BBC are anxious to get it back, and the collectors think, well, why should I give it back to them? They've done nothing. They're not going to pay me for it. I might return some material which will be worth a lot of money for them, but there's nothing in it for me.
Despite the misgivings of some, the Missing Believed Wiped initiative goes from strength to strength. In November 2003, it celebrated its 10th anniversary with a screening of At Last, the 1948 show, featuring a new introduction recorded by John Cleese.
Over the years, material has been rediscovered from different sources and has been painstakingly reassembled and rebuilt.
This was the first time that the BFI has been able to restore a show using modern editing techniques.
At last, the 1948 show!
The latest complete restored edition of that last 1948 show, we started to reconstruct a couple of years ago. The main source was a series of compilation shows that had come back from Swedish television, which had a large number of sketches from separate shows. And this one particular show had more sketches than any other. So we reconstructed it using an audio recording of the show that had been made by a fan at the time, and using stills and scripts from the ITC library. So we had the shell of the show with a couple of points at which there was nothing. Then, as luck would have it, we had this material back from Australia, from ABC, and the one complete sketch that was missing from this At Last the 1948 show was on that reel. So we were able simply to drop that into place just a few weeks ago. I think it is a lost masterpiece. It's one that's been forgotten. It's time that that show got reassessed, and the only way to reassess it is to see it.
For John Cleese, the show's recovery had great personal significance.
Sorry about the door. And the cups. Not at all. Sit down. Oh, thank you very much. Mr.
Waring.
Oh, good. I'm sorry, Madam Chair. I was asked by David Frost to do a show with Tim Brooke Taylor, and it was immediately after I'd been working with David on the Frost Report. And the Frost Report was a terrific experience, but it was a little more conservative in terms of the kind of material they used. So when David gave us the opportunity, along with Graham Chapman and Marty Feldman, to do pretty much what we liked, it was tremendously exciting because, I mean, how many people ever get a chance to take those kind of risks?
Does he often do that? Oh, yes, frequently. Sometimes I think I must be terribly lucky. Hello, Miss Grom. Would you remind me, please, quickly, is this office on the ground floor? Yes, sir. Fine, you can go home now, Miss Grom. Thank you, sir. Sure. Raining again? No.
I think At Last the 1948 show stands as the most important of the pre-Monty Python shows. It's the one that most directly leads on to Monty Python. So in the same way as The Complete and Utter History of Britain, it's there as a record of how certain comedy talents developed and how the Monty Python team came towards each other and towards the unique brand of comedy that was Monty Python. But it's hilarious in its own right.
Correct! What is the angle of the plane of movement of the two outer and brighter of the four main satellites of Uranus with the ecliptic? 82 degrees! Correct! What is the square root of 7,974? 89.3! Correct! All right, Diamond, I don't want to do this, but I'm gonna kill you. Why? You know too much!
I'm really rather touched that the BFI are doing this work and finding old shows and really carrying out acts of detection to sort of figure out, when they have a piece of material, where it went in what show. I think it's terrific that they're doing it, because unusually good works of art, and some television shows are works of art, are quite rare. I mean, the first law of... Well, the first thing you should tell your children before you tell them about sex is that 95% of everything is not very good. So when you get that 5%, and there was a lot of that around in the Golden Age, it's lovely to be able to hang on to it, because goodness knows when it'll come back into fashion again.
In fact, old television has never been more in fashion than now. At the Edinburgh Festival in 2003, the BBC's Director-General announced the Creative Archive Initiative, proposing greater access to its collection.
Up until now, this huge resource has remained locked up, inaccessible to the public, because there hasn't been an effective mechanism for distribution. But the digital revolution and the broadband are changing all that.
The Creative Archive is a great idea. It's opening up the archives to a much wider access to the public. However, there's a lot of rights issues involved, and I think that at the very early stages about looking at how they clear those rights. And I think in the beginning there'll probably be clips available of, say, educational programmes or natural history programmes.
I hope the BBC's Creative Archive initiative will be able to make whole programmes available. I think at the moment it's about making clips available for people to manipulate. I think there's another use as well, which is making our history available for us to be looked at as history, as heritage.
Entertainment and comedy shows of the 60s, which were once seen as ephemeral, have now come to be seen as precious cultural artifacts. The pressure is now on the broadcasters to preserve their archive for public access. 600,000 hours of television programmes are stored in this BBC archive. Every year, 135,000 tapes and films are ordered up by broadcasters for inclusion in television programmes. That's 700 dispatches every day. The BBC has come to realise that its archive is a goldmine in a world where nostalgia sells.
There's a much more coherent policy towards the archive and the television programmes now, but it has to be said that that's driven by finances. It's because there's money in old television that we look after the television of today.
The cultural importance of entertainment programmes is no longer in any doubt. But because they weren't considered valuable in the past, some golden moments are still not in the archive. Although the BFI and BBC's initiatives to recover lost television have been a great success, what's the Holy Grail? What's still missing, believed white?
I think I'd most like to see returned the 3 episodes of Dad's Army that are missing, because that's all that are missing from Dad's Army.
A recording of Nigel Neal's The Robe.
Programmes like The Likely Lads, where a lot of material is missing again.
One of the first BBC soap operas, a series called Compact.
There's also Madhouse on Castle Street, a famous BBC play of the 60s, which starred Bob Dylan, brought over especially to appear in it. It would be wonderful if this could be found. The Dylan fans have been searching for it for years.
Although there may not have been a golden age of British television, certainly the past has produced a lot of what you could call masterpieces, which sadly failed to survive.
Stay with us now as we bring you some of those classics that were missing, believed wiped, starting with a pre-Python sketch show from John Cleese and Graham Chapman. At last, in a moment.